Hello, this is Tanner. I'm driving, but I figured I would ramble about creature design philosophy, stream of consciousness, while I drove. I recently got inspired watching a movie. I think that inspiration, especially when it comes to creature design, is really important. You can't copy your inspiration exactly, otherwise you're a knockoff, but incorporating elements from things you enjoy, things that you find interesting, either in nature, media, movies, what have you. There's no original ideas, so don't be afraid to use elements from something else. One example being, I recently took a toy spider from my friend's house. I told him later that I took it, and he didn't even care. But the spider looks like a little tarantula, and I started thinking as I saw it about funnel webs and how some spiders, maybe not tarantulas, have trap doors. And I thought about trapped doors in Dungeons and Dragons, and from there I thought, what if a trapped door or a stuck door was really a giant spider hiding behind it, waiting to feel the vibrations through the door handle. You turn the door handle and the door swings open and a spider lunges out and grabs you. I thought that would be a really memorable dungeon monster. It almost seems like a classic monster idea. So I ran with it. After thinking about the initial idea you have for a monster, you usually try to expand on it in a way that seems natural. When I say this, I mean, I don't like pasting monsters in dungeons where they obviously don't belong. Part of the fun of creature design and dungeon design for me is thinking about the ecosystem and how the creatures, would normally act in that ecosystem. You don't have to get too granular about it, but if you think back to science class, for every, I don't know how many herbivore species, you're going to have one carnivore species, right? You can't have 20 carnivore species and no herbivores. It doesn't make sense. They'd starve. You need to have plenty of things that aren't necessarily scary. When players go into a dungeon, they anticipate every monster's there to kill them, because generally that's the role of the monster, is to kill the player. Well, let's turn that on its head. What if most of the monsters didn't want to kill the player, and the ones that did don't look like it? Stay with me. When players go into a dungeon and they see things that are kind of gross or creepy looking, maybe giant slugs eating lichen off the dungeon floor, some kind of creepy crawly that just happens to live in that dungeon, day in and day out, all day they just sit in the dark eating moss, crawling around. Think about that. Think about all the different species, little things, fungi, worms, insects, etc., that survive in this dungeon all day waiting for, nothing in particular, until the players happen to shine a light on them. It's like upturning a rock. Now, when players discover something that looks dangerous, they're going to assume they have to kill it, right? In the old school, you could gain experience through circumventing or avoiding a particular encounter or monster, not just through killing it. In fact, danger is so risky in the old school, and death was such an such a real threat that you didn't necessarily want to fight everything. You wanted to avoid it. You wanted to try. Fighting was a last-ditch effort. My back is against the wall. I need to. It's him or me, right? So let's talk about perception and how the player's perception of a creature influences their behavior, right? Obviously, as I said, if you see a goblin with a knife lunging at you, you're going to fight or flight. I have to fight this thing, I have to kill it, right? What if it was a creature that didn't necessarily look dangerous? What if it was a large... I wrote a creature that's a very large plecostomus, or suckerfish. It has arms and legs, and it's kind of like the size of a gorilla. Now, saying that, you have the negative connotation that, or bias, that gorilla is dangerous, large is dangerous. Human perception tends to view things that are bigger than itself as dangerous, because in the wild it would be. Now, this plecostomus spends its time in caves eating moss, like a lot of the other creatures I end up creating. I'm biased. It spends its time just kind of sucker fishing on the walls, eating moss and lichen and what have you. Just crap, right? It doesn't necessarily go out of its way to kill things, because it doesn't have to. Players that encounter this are going to see a large, fleshy, gooey fish with muscular limbs suckerfish to the wall. Not aggressive, it's not going to come lunging at you. So what does the perception say? Well, it's big, but it's not acting aggressive. It's not like, this brings me on another topic of like, the perception of eyes and how something's eyes influence their intentions and behavior. But this fish isn't necessarily staring at you, it's just kind of looking off. Maybe it's barely moving, its mouth is kind of moving as it eats moss. This seems not worth fighting, especially if there isn't like gold to be gained from it, right? Again, in the old school experience, you don't just grind monsters to level up. Experience is a 1-to-1 gold to experience ratio. Obviously, you get some experience for killing monsters, but you're not incentivized to just go murder everything, because it doesn't make sense. So, in this case, players that see something large, something that could be intimidating but isn't aggressive initially, will tend to avoid it, tend to study it for a moment at a distance, and move on. Now, what if you had to get past it? What if the next room, what if it's eating moss, on the door frame leading to the only exit from that room, that cavern or whatever? As soon as you get close to this thing's food source, it gets aggressive. And it, like, twists your head off or something. Something brutal. That's gorilla strength, so imagine angering a gorilla eating, right? Suddenly, this benign thing becomes very intimidating, and it twists the fight around. How do you avoid pissing off this giant fish, the amphibian thing, right? From there, I could talk about perception in terms of a creature's eyes. We tend to look at things' faces, eyes, facial expressions, nonverbals, for an idea of where they stand. Example, if you are an adventurer and you open a door, right, and inside is a monster and its eyes are wide, its pupils are dilated, maybe it has a surprised look on its face, you may think it's going to act rashly. It's going to jump into action, either attack you or run away, because it's surprised, it's startled. Versus open the door and that same creature has glazed over eyes. It's alive, but it's just not responding to any stimuli or input. It's not going to be as intimidating because it doesn't really think about you or react to your presence. So players aren't going to react as promptly in that case, because A creature isn't. If you open a door and something runs at you, you're going to respond quickly because you don't have time to respond. Think about fight or flight animals. When your adrenaline gets pumping, you either run or you fight. Or in some cases, you freeze, but that's a whole other conversation. Freezing occurs when you can't fight or flight. So, when talking about eyes, the size of the eyes, the dilation of the pupils, the movement of the eyes, the placement of the eyes. Think about, in nature, carnivores' eyes are front-facing. Herbivore eyes are side-facing. So like a horse or a sheep, they're on the sides of the head. Versus a carnivore, they're on the front. A tiger, etc. If you see a creature, maybe even without that specific knowledge, a player that sees an animal or a creature with eyes on the side of its head, it's like looking at you by tilting its entire head so one eye can see you. It's going to respond differently than a creature whose face is angled at you and is glaring. In that case, it's a lot more intimidating. Glaring has a negative connotation and it makes you assume that it's angry, right? But using language that's less charged, we can look at it from a different perspective. No pun intended, talking about eyes. What if the creature had compound eyes, right? Like a big fly, or something with a fly's eyes. The poet hadn't even realized it. When that happens, it doesn't look at you, although it is. You can't really tell where it's looking because it's looking everywhere. So when we'll keep using that example. You open the door and see this creature, right? And it has compound eyes. How do you respond? Well, if it doesn't like tilt its head or move, if it just is still, but it has compound eyes, that's intimidating because where is it looking? You can't see, you can't gauge its intentions. The less human it is, or the less close to a human, the harder it is to gauge intentions and read body language, read these nonverbal or even paraverbal at times forms of communication, right? That's why things like giant insects or crustaceans I really enjoy. I think they're really scary. Maybe not scary in the terms of, you know, a monster, like a traditional monster that's gonna jump out of a closet and scare you. But the giant lobster, I'm biased, of course, because I love crayfish, crustaceans. But when you think about the giant lobster, it's a walking tank with huge pincers, long antenna, and two eyes you can't read. You can't gauge a lobster's intentions. You can assume, based on your previous knowledge outside the game, that a lobster is going to act a particular way. Again, I have additional knowledge because I have a pet crayfish that I watch every day. However, if you didn't have a pet crayfish, and you have some idea of what lobsters do, they pinch, they kind of walk slowly, and some like jet backwards when they're afraid. So with that knowledge, the basic knowledge, you can gauge roughly what's going to happen. With my knowledge, they eat everything. They never stop eating. So if something shows up and is moving that's smaller than itself, if it's in an environment where it can move freely, it's going to, use its long antenna, and it's going to quickly scuttle forward and try to grab whatever it can. If it's intimidated, it's going to open its pincers and flare up backwards to make itself look bigger. Ironically, if we're talking about a giant lobster, it may not need to do that because it's already huge. But what if that giant lobster was fighting something even bigger than itself, right? Then yeah, it's going to flare up and to look bigger. If a dragon is trying to get at it. When you read I think it's the 2nd edition AD&D Monster Manual, it talks about how giant crayfish are just normal lobsters or normal crayfish that grew to tremendous size over a long period of time. I love that. I think that is excellent monster design because it's something we have in real life that became monstrous. Because let's think of the philosophy of what is a monster. What is alien, right? Something we don't know or understand. In the case of a giant lobster, humans in our world have a pretty good idea of what they are and what they do. But let's look at it from the perspective of people in the past that didn't have exposure, internet access, right? In the old days, the traveling circus would bring exotic animals, and this was life-changing for those that went to the circus. That's why the circus is such a big deal, because those that went were exposed to things that they've never seen. These individuals farming their entire lives suddenly had an opportunity to look at a tiger. They didn't see videos of tigers. They didn't have exposure to this. A tiger was a monster. When you looked in the past, those that encountered elephants thought they were beasts. They were huge. They had trunks. It was strange. They had tusks. Speaking of tusks, I should incorporate that more in my monster design. I rarely use tusks or horns. Going back to eyes, compound eyes, crustacean or insect eyes, it's hard to gauge the intentions of the monster when they're not as human or mammalian. Because mammals' eyes, we can read, we understand. Let's talk about understanding comprehension versus incomprehension and how that impacts monster design. Even with outside knowledge or meta-knowledge of specific monsters, or even players that have meta-knowledge but try not to act upon it will still behave differently than when you interact with a monster that you've never heard of. Example, mimics. I say this word and you immediately think of a chest with teeth. Unless you are living under a rock, only employing basic expert D&D, you would come to a different conclusion. In the old days, a mimic was like a form of slime almost. Not really a slime, but it was gelatinous and took the appearance of a chest without actually being one. And they didn't have teeth. They had a pseudopod they would thwack you with, and they were sticky. They had an adhesive, so they'd thwack you and stick to you. So, with the meta-knowledge of a chest with teeth due to constant video game adaptations, Dark Souls, Dragon Quest, etc., where it's a thrashing chest with teeth, right? Almost like Mario 64's piano. That, I think, is also a classic mimic. That meta-knowledge, that comprehension, even if you're not trying to act on it actively, when you see a chest, you're going to try to be wary of that chest, even if you don't know that it is a mimic or what a mimic is. Even if your character, let's say, has never heard of a mimic in universe, the player will still behave a little more cautiously, maybe even at an unconscious level, because they don't want to get eaten or thwacked, if you think about the old version. Now, how does that change if it's a monster that I made up, that you've never read about? Something that came out of my head and I've never shown to my players, right? How do you interact? Here's a good example. I made a mimic type creature, right? You're already going to have some expectation because I said mimic. It's only a mimic insofar as it interacts with chests. Now, this creature lives inside chests as often as it can, right? The player doesn't know this necessarily. The player might hear something rustling about in a chest. They're going to use their meta-knowledge to assume it's a mimic, right? The subversion of expectations that I use, this, I'll put it in quotes, mimic, doesn't eat you. In fact, it's not really aggressive at all. It's more afraid of you than it is of you it. I should practice speaking. This creature eats treasure, slowly digests it while waiting inside the chest for a very long time as a slow digestion process. So it just chills and relaxes in the chest. And it's very anxious, has very large eyes. Again, large eyes. You think prey. million. It's a head footer. It's a big round head with arms and legs. When you see this chest, you might catch a glimpse of the chest open and these large eyes peering out of it anxiously, looking for things walking by, right? This thing holds the chest shut. If you don't know and you're trying to open it, it'll be difficult to open the chest. Not because it's locked, because it's actively trying to keep you out from opening it. It's like a shell or like a hermit crab, something like that. Now, this creature, it eats gold, it eats treasure, and after it's done, it shits inside the chest and leaves the chest full of poop. Again, this subverts the expectations of players. Players have meta knowledge that treasure chests have treasure. Duh. It might have equipment or other things, but generally gold, right? Or any kind of treasure. Now, imagine opening a chest and it's full of diarrhea. That's going to affect the players, because it is very different than what they expected. It's unique. It gives them something to play with. That's not just gold. Tanner, how does a player play with diarrhea? That's up to the players. Now, if I say now anymore, I'm going to bite my tongue. When a player interacts with this creature, a mimic, their meta knowledge says it's going to attack them, right? If they were to open this chest, its eyes pop out and maybe it makes a loud screaming noise. Not to necessarily, you know, threaten the players, but maybe it's an evolutionary adaptation to scare away things that open the chest. Buy it some time to get away. It then jumps out of the chest and runs, takes off. It's obviously still digesting the treasure. Players might not know that. The player's first instinct may be to kill it, right? So if players are chasing after it, it might expunge or expel a gem or some gold behind it to try to stop the players from chasing it. Ironically, this is one of the way the old school creatures tended to behave or act. Albeit the opposite direction. So, in that case, it would be a player being chased by creatures, if they were intelligent, could throw, like, gold behind it, and the creature potentially would stop to pick up the gold. Or if it was an unintelligent creature, they'd throw meat behind them, or some kind of food. The creature might settle for the meat instead of continuing to chase. Because if it was a creature that's chasing you to eat you, well, then it has food. It doesn't have to eat you anymore, right? Okay, going back to my conversation regarding unknown versus known. Players that interact with a creature, they have no idea what it does or how they interact with the environment, are going to enjoy it more because they're using their brain. They're actively thinking. They're not just relying on past knowledge or information that they've read or played in a video game or whatever to act. Because then you're just automated. I see a mimic. I poke it with a 10-foot stick. It attacks the stick. Okay, whatever. Obviously, that's how you'd interact with this creature. You don't have to really think. If you see a creature that's bipedal, very long vertical torso, cone-shaped head with a point or a flap, like a rigid scooping shape, 2 eyes, hanging sacks of fat. How are you going to interact with this? Good question. Now, if you hang back and observe, you may see it grouting the dungeon tile, the bricks, to scoop out insects and, you know, smegma. Incorrect use of the term, but I think it's particularly visceral. And then it eats it. That's fucking disgusting. But it's not necessarily aggressive. It's just eating shit in the dungeon, right? That's not alive, or at least alive to a big enough extent, right? It's still a monster. Now, if you get too close to it, maybe it bleats and runs, or jumps, or it, you know, has some kind of defensive mechanism. It sprays stink gas at you, or it attracts wandering monsters, which may seem counterintuitive. Who knows? The point is, using creatures that players don't anticipate or can't understand or have trouble to decipher what they do and how they interact with the world around it is going to be much more interesting than just, you encounter 5 goblins. Perhaps not. You can roleplay with 5 goblins. That brings me to the topic of monsters you can interact with more than just fighting or running from. Monsters with some semblance of intelligence. Example, the Roper. The Roper looks like a stalactite or stalagmite until you get within range of its tentacles. It has a single eye and a mouth. It lunges out the tentacles and reels you in and eats you. Well, a bit of information states that Ropers have the intelligence of an orc, roughly. That changes everything. Now, this thing can grab you, hold you by, your ankle upside down, and then barter with you for your life. That makes an encounter much more interesting because you're interacting with something bizarre, something whose, mind is so different than your own. You're interfacing with something inhuman. That's fun. Fun is subjective and it differs from person to person. Some people may not have fun being dangled by their ankle and bartering for their life. If you're like Crystal, my girlfriend, you're going to have more fun sneaking around picking pockets. I have fun interacting with the weird bits of the ecosystem and seeing how they interplay. That's why it's boring to me when a dungeon master doesn't put that thought into it. I don't blame you. You don't want to put too much thought. You can't simulate everything in a world. You may not put too much thought into the specific monster placed in a dungeon. You may be more concerned with, the treasure, the politics of the overarching, groups on the surface. Yeah, different people like different things. Shocker. You can't please everyone. But with my design, I enjoy the creatures. I enjoy strange monsters and how interacting with them changes the way the player dungeon crawls. The fun of Dungeons & Dragons is interacting with weird monsters. Another monster I thought up is a little more off the wall. So, recently, I was at a thrift shop and I see a slot machine pencil sharpener. Roughly 3 inches tall, 2 or 3 inches wide. It's still pretty large for a miniature scale. And I got thinking, wow, this would make a cool monster. Obviously it's a machine, and that doesn't really fit into Dungeons & Dragons because it's Dungeons & Dragons, right? It's not a sci-fi game. Although you could argue that Dungeons & Dragons is science fantasy based off a couple particular modules from the past in which you'd explore a spaceship or what have you. I digress. I find this slot machine pencil sharpener, and I think, how would a how would a slot machine function as a creature? Well, perhaps it's a remnant of a past era bygone. I know that's a tired trope of fantasy world exists in the future, far in a galaxy far away, whatever, right? It's overdone. But if you do it to very, very, very limited extent, it'll be fun for players. If they almost never interact with anything outside of fantasy, if it's a super rare encounter, they're gonna have more fun with it. So, this creature, I put a metal plate of a face covering a spot that I didn't really like on it. So it has something that's a little more human-like, even if it's not animated, even if it's just a plate to resemble like an image, right? Decoration. It's not actually a creature's face. It just kind of serves as one when you look at it. Kind of telling the player that it's a creature, right? Well, wait, Tanner, this is a slot machine. It's not a monster. What if it had feet? What if it had legs? Now it's a monster because it can move, it can locomote, it has some form of mobility, it has agency, it interacts with the environment more than a slot machine would. It doesn't just sit there. A common conversation I had with my friend Steven, Big Boy Game Time, is regarding the use of legs on non-monstrous or non-miniatures. Putting legs on anything makes it fun. When I look at a gumball machine, dollhouse, model, toy, whatever, I think, what if I put legs on it? How would that work? Again, similar to the slot machine, it would be some kind of remnant of the past human era, right? Of our current day society. So this big slot machine with feet, I use a feet from a Data, the Next Generation Star Trek action figure, because they were kind of shiny and they looked like formal shoes. It worked. They're about the right size. Don't put too much thought in it. Don't overthink it. We're not here to win a golden demon. We're here to have fun. Some people find that fun. I don't get it. But in this case, this monster, it's a slot machine with feet. It's not really monstrous yet. So let's start from the beginning. How would the players discover this monster? Perhaps they're at a tavern and they hear rumors. This slot machine, I should mention, has the words on the front naming the slot machine the Golden Eagle. Initially, I was going to cover this up or scrape it off or change it because it didn't really match. It didn't make sense. But I remembered I love the incomprehensible. I love things that confuse or surprise you because that's interesting. Objectively. Now, the Golden Eagle obviously implies a golden eagle. And if it's a creature, let's think about how stories of this monster will be obviously confused over time. Let's say that this slot machine monster, let's say that slot machines don't exist in a fantasy world other than the past remnant of blah, 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 human 2020, whatever, right? Let's pretend that adventurers, fantasy clerics, and knights have never seen a slot machine. But they, at some point, perhaps visited this dungeon, have comprehended the scripts of Golden Eagle, maybe a magic user, red languages or something. And they managed to escape this dungeon alive and tell stories about it. And those stories are passed from bard to bard, from bar wench to barkeep. And now, instead of being a giant machine or block, it is literally a golden eagle. It is described as this golden eagle that bestows riches onto those who interact with it, right? Think about the corruption of data over time. Not in a technical sense, but like the game Telephone. Every time it gets told, little details change until the story is completely different, or almost completely different than when it started. How fun is that? Players now hear the story of a golden eagle that bestows riches on those that talk to it. They prepare for this dungeon crawl, roughly knowing where this dungeon is located. Preparing nets and things to catch a bird. They delve into a dungeon and find an old casino that's overrun with normal creatures, maybe undead skeletons if you want to get really cliche, like the old people sitting at, bar tables or interacting strangely with, skeletons dead at the roulette table, like a nuclear bomb blew them out when they were just gambling, whatever. Now, in this example, I bit my tongue. In this example, players show up, and the meta knowledge from the human puppeting this character knows that it's a casino. but they have to roleplay how their character would interact with the casino without the knowledge of a modern-day casino. That's fun. It's novel. It's unique. They likely have never done this before. At least in a tabletop game. I hope not, at least. In this example, if they do encounter this giant slot machine with feet, how does it serve as a creature? We'll get back to the design philosophy. You would assume it attacks you because creatures are dangerous, right? It steps on you or it tries to flatten you because it's heavy and it's blocky. Boring! No, we're not doing that. What if it's blocking passage? It's huge, it's blocky, it's heavy. It's not necessarily intimidating. Maybe you show up and it motion senses something's in front of it and it plays a garbled, like, I don't know. Welcome! 777! Play free! Whatever. It has some stupid advertisement. Perhaps the players don't even understand this English language because common isn't English. Perhaps they just hear a garbled, loud, automated voice and they don't know what to make sense of it. Using paraverbal knowledge, or the way in which we talk, influences what we're communicating. So if we're talking like this, we're communicating something different than if we're talking like this. Even if we're using the same words, right? That's paraverbal communication. So if they hear a jolly voice and they don't know what it's saying, they can imply that it's not angry because it's a jolly voice, even if we don't know what it's saying, right? So the slot machine uses a jolly voice in another language, and it doesn't seem aggressive. Players might cheat a little bit because it's a slot machine and they want to play the slot machine and infer that they can put gold into it to play. I would allow it as a DM because we're here to have fun. Fuck it. I'm not going to make them necessarily learn how to operate this thing unless it's extremely different than anything they've experienced. So they interact with this slot machine, they put some gold into it. Maybe it accepts smaller gold pieces, whatever. Again, don't simulate things too one-to-one, because that isn't fun. Fun is it's imperative to focus on the fun. You don't want to bog down a fun encounter with realism. That's why we're playing a fantasy game. So you put gold into it, and then you roll casino dice. I have slot machine dice with lemons and bar and cherries and whatever. That is fun. That is interesting. It's unique. Players have likely not rolled D6 as a slot machine, where they can potentially gamble and earn more money, right? Depending on what they roll, the DM should be prepared with a table to show what lemon, lemon, lemon pays out, right? So doing this, again, this isn't much of a monster, it's a slot machine. It's not attacking you. But in the old school, wandering monsters were a threat. You have to roll to see how likely a randomly generated monster, or when I say randomly generated, I don't mean the monster itself, I just mean you roll on the table and see what kind of monster you encounter or encounters you. What if this thing, the slot machine, was so loud, even if you lost, winner, loser, it's loud. It's making ridiculous slot machine casino noises. You're going to be attracting monsters with a racket, right? So maybe it increases the wandering monster frequency significantly. Imagine trying to play a slot machine and 3 lizard men kick down the door and come to fight you while the slot machine is still blaring, "Play the slot machine!" Because it's not aware, it's not programmed to interact with lizard men attacking wizards. It's not a normal occurrence, right? The slot machine isn't going to aggro and start kicking you with its new feet, right? No, it's going to continue being a slot machine. And players are going to laugh. This brings me to the topic of humor. Humor is important. Oh my god, how boring is it if your DM is lecturing you like a professor would in a monotone voice with no humor to their game? I'm sure that's the cup of tea for many a professor. But when I play tabletop games, I don't want grimdark. I don't want serious. I don't want dour or depressing. Maybe on occasion, that's a fun flavor. But I want humor. I don't want constant jokes. I just want a light-hearted cartoon tabletop game. I want Adventure Time without it being Adventure Time, without it being its own unique thing. I like to imagine my campaigns, my adventures, my sessions in a cartoony, high saturation, low detail way. I think that's fun. I think that's endearing. The players may not see it that way, but I like to explain the grass is very green, the sky is very blue. I like to explain things in a cartoony way. If you cut somebody's head off, I don't want it to be gruesome, like a beheading video. I don't want to think about real-world horror while I'm playing a tabletop role-playing game. I want to think about somebody's head being lopped off in a cartoonish way, if it were to happen. It's not as traumatizing or brutal, because that's not fun. If it's a party member whose head gets cut off, maybe then we describe it differently and it affects the players in a different way. These are important things to keep in mind when DMing, or in writing stories or sessions or creatures in general. If we talk more about humor, the slot machine, I was talking about my creature, the chestnut, earlier. The creature that shits in chests. Humor is important. That creature shits in chests. That's funny. That's novel. It's different. It's unique. It's fun. It's cartoony. A slot machine pouring out gold while you fight lizard men and attract them with its loud casino noises is an image. I can see that in my mind's eye. I want that framed on my wall. A traveler opening a chest to poop, and in the distance, a little creature running away, maybe shitting out a gold piece. I want that image. That's fun. That's hilarious. It's exciting. You can't force humor. Things are funny when you don't know how to process it. If we think about the anatomy of humor, thinking about the anatomy of humor, that brings me to a joke I've heard. I'm not a great joke teller, but hear me out. Humor, no, I'm going to butcher this. Humor and dissections are similar. You can explain exactly how the joke works, akin to dissecting a frog, but it kills the joke. It kills the frog. So, in my describing of humor, it's not going to be very funny, right? I can't explain why the joke is funny, because that's not funny. It's not funny to explain how something works. Funniness, humor, laughter is processing stimuli you don't fully understand, that's surprising, and your body tries to cope or compensate by reacting in a way of laughter, right? This is why when we encounter something maybe stressful, or encounter something kind of scary or kind of serious or upsetting, we might laugh. Not hilarity, but we might have a nervous laugh, right? And people will respond, why are you laughing? This isn't funny. Because the idea of funniness has a bias or connotation of positive. Clowns, well, clowns have a different connotation now, but stand-up, right? So, using that knowledge, humor is derived from trying to process something and having unexpected results. Not the monster telling you knock-knock jokes. If a monster acts in a way that you didn't anticipate, players are going to laugh because they didn't expect it. It's surprising. It's unique. Example, How about, let me think about a weird creature that I created that you wouldn't normally anticipate how it acts. Okay, I got a good one. I have a creature that's a clam with 2 long legs, thin legs. The clam's shell can open and you see its little face inside. Kind of human-ish, but very mollusk-like as well. Now, I think I called them clam kids. These creatures, what would you expect they'd do? I'll give you 10 seconds to think. That's about 10 seconds. I'm gonna guess that you thought they had a pearl. I'm gonna guess that you thought they might squirt water. They might clasp shut and like bite by clasping shut quickly. These are valid thoughts. These are valid ideas. When I thought of this creature, I thought about, you heard what I named them already, so you have an idea. Clam kids. What if, they're not really kids, but what if they were mischievous in a way that a youth would? What if they like playing practical jokes that are more or less harmless? In my idea, clam kids would giggle often. They would smile with rubbery lips inside their shell. They would run into you to knock you over. Particularly if you're a seaman, not seaman, get your head out of a gutter. If you're a seaman on a dock, a slippery pier, trying to unload cargo, and this clam thing runs over to you and bowls you over and maybe knocks you to the water. It might be dangerous if there's, if it's not very deep water, there's sharks or something, but maybe you just fall over or you get drenched. That's not as dangerous, but it's frustrating. These clams have high armor class, although they're not particularly dangerous, making them quite the nuisance. They're called kids because they giggle and they're mischievous, but they're not really young, they're not youth. This may be funny to players, not just because of the mischievous antics, but because watching a clam tackle people to knock them over subverts your expectations. Let's talk about responding to threats and the appraisal process. I won't go through the exact stress appraisal process word for word because I'm driving and I don't want to butcher it. But when you evaluate some stimulus, some stimuli perhaps, you first gauge whether or not it's something benign, something intimidating, something relevant, right? If it is relevant, if it isn't, if it isn't dangerous information, you're not going to really feel much regarding it. You're not going to feel stressed. You're not going to respond. I'm driving right now and I'm scanning for deer. If I see a road sign on the side of the road, I'm not going to fucking swerve my car, right? I'm not going to respond differently. If I see a silhouette of a deer, we'll say that this is a dead deer, but I see a deer. I'm going to respond differently. My heart is going to fluctuate in a weird way. I have experience with deer, so I'm going to respond maybe a little more exaggeratedly than a normal person would. Even if it's dead, my heart's going to kind of act weird. I'm going to think about it more. I might stress a little more because even if it's dead, I evaluate it as potentially dangerous because this tells me there are deer in the area and a deer can run in front of the car. If I see a living deer, even if it's not running, it's going to move down to the next step of the process of, okay, I evaluated this thing, this stimuli as potentially dangerous, as important, as relevant. How do I interact with it? Do I have the capability to react? If it's in the distance and I have ample time to slow down, I'm not going to feel as anxious or stressed as I would if it was currently running in the street at a pretty close distance. This isn't the best example because you don't have much time to interact with it. But I'll shift to a different example. let's say that this stimuli is an upcoming examination. Maybe one that you're really not prepared for, a physical examination. You can't really prepare for it other than working out, whatever. You can't, let's say that upon initial appraisal, this is relevant because you're the one being examined. It's threatening because it tells a lot about your future, or it's relevant to what you want to do, right? You're being examined to see if you're proficient in a specific task or ability. Next, you decide if you have the ability to deal with it. If you are skilled, you're not going to be as stressed because although it's a scary test, you have the capability of doing well on it. You have that knowledge or ability. What if you didn't? What if you did not have the capability of swerving that deer? You're coming too fast. What if you were not good at that skill? You're going to feel anxious. You're going to feel stressed. You're going to respond differently. Regarding this to dungeon design, creature design, this appraisal process happens automatically within the human controlling the character. Unless you're me, or another person that has this knowledge about the stress appraisal process, you're not going to be thinking about how your player appraises stress. You're going to be appraising the stress for your character, right? Sorry, or how your character appraises stress. You're going to be doing it for your character. Automatically. That's part of being human. It's automatic. I'm almost arriving where I'm supposed to drive to, so I'll conclude some of my thoughts. There are a lot of elements of monster design other than just pasting a monster somewhere. You gotta think about many, many aspects of that monster. You gotta think about how it, well, you don't gotta. There's very few things in life you gotta do. But if you wanna have a unique and fun, humorous encounter, maybe you should put a little more thought into that monster than just pasting a jelly or an ooze or a goblin. Although those can be used well and used in a unique way, consider using weird monsters. Think up monsters. Even if you don't know too much about how to create monsters for the system you're utilizing, refer to other creatures that are similar and use similar stat blocks. Hell, players don't have the exact knowledge of what stats it has, unless the system allows them to. They don't really need to know that it's a reskin of a different enemy with a different behavior, a different face. If it's a humanoid, goblinish creature, just use the goblin stat block and then give it new behavior or personality. The players won't focus too hard on the differences because it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, the things that really matter are the thoughts and attention you put into it. It shows when you care. When a DM puts time and thought, love, effort, energy into creating a creature or a dungeon, it makes it that much more interesting for the player. One time I ran a dungeon that was a cavern system. Many types of fungi and unique creatures. An ecosystem that all interacted with each other. And as players intervened in this ecosystem, they had to become part of it. I was told this is one of the best dungeons I've ran. It's not literally a dungeon, it's a cavern, but you get the gist. Why was this one of the best? I asked myself that question for a long time because I never really got back to that level of excitement in other dungeons as I tried different ideas. And I kept asking myself, why is this one dungeon so much better than the other ones I write? It's because of the thought and energy I put into each element in each interactive point. When a player moves through this dungeon, they're interested in every hallway because of the different types of fungi, types of small organisms that are living in that thing. Not just centipedes, but maybe there are some kind of cavernous lobster, a small one, not a giant one like I was talking about earlier. And that small lobster is known to be stewed in taverns up on the surface. They're delicious, albeit rock hard shell, right? What if a specific type of fungus you could hide inside of, like a blanket, but it makes you really itchy, right? But the players don't know this. They're not sure how to, unless they happen to have that knowledge and character. Let's say this character is a really intelligent mycologist or something. they would ask the DM, hey, do I know this? And they roll under intelligence, something along those lines, to see if they happen to know of it. Most players won't. Most players will have to use their human or character brains to decipher, interpret the stress appraisal system. Is this fungi dangerous? I made a fungi, kind of like monster design, fungi design. Fungi people disregarded. Just fungi, monsters in a form of fungi. It's monster design. Think about the violet fungus or shriekers. They scream and attract monsters when you get close to them. That's their entire purpose. And then they eat the decomposing bodies of the adventurers or monsters killed around them. Right? When you're appraising this fungus, the blanket fungus that's sticky, it has like drops of red, almost like blood covering it. Again, I'm biasing the player by explaining it like blood. I should just say the red droplets. The players have to appraise if this is something dangerous or not. Now, look, tongue bite. Another example of a fungi that I created were like roughly human-sized stalks of dandelion-like fungi. When I say dandelion, I mean, I don't know if it's flowering, seeding dandelions, where you could blow on it and all the little airborne, seeds take flight. Imagine a fungi that's long strands with many, many hairs that grow frequently. And when brushed against or a strong wind blows, it spreads them like a cloud, and it's really hard. It's like high density spores that cloud the air. I created this to serve the function of a smoke bomb for this giant monster that's chasing you through a dungeon. Players run through it, and cloud of, spores or whatever block out vision. I didn't put much more thought into it than that, because I was writing a bunch of different fungi that should be in this dungeon. Players interacting with it that didn't know why I wrote it became really stressed and would not touch this fungus because they thought they breathed it in, they would fucking die. I didn't think about this. So what happened was, all these areas I put full of this fungus I intended to be a hiding space became, for lack of a better word, dangerous. It became extremely hazardous, almost like barbed wire. It never was dangerous, but the players are treating it like barbed wire because they don't want to fucking touch it, because they think it could kill them. Makes sense. That changes the entire dungeon in the way that I created it, making it much more difficult. Until a player was forced to go into it and discover that it's not filling their lungs with spores. Right? But that's fun. That's memorable. That's interesting. It's humorous. That makes good monster design, dungeon design, design in general. I'm arriving where I set out to go, so I'm going to bid thee farewell. I appreciate your time listening. This monologue was sponsored by Miscast. Not really. Trent didn't give me any money. But I'll give him a shout out because I love Trent. This Trent shout out was sponsored by Goobins Gids. Goobins paid me gold pieces to talk about Trent. Believe you me, I am 3 GP richer than I started this conversation. Maybe now I could play the slot machine Golden Eagle and get killed by lizardmen. Have a great day. Enjoy your painting. I hope you finish the model. Get varnishing. Remember, watch those fingers. Your base rim might chip at the edges if you didn't paint it or it's overhanging. Clean that overspill. I can see it. It's between the eyeball and the cheek. Fix it. All right, later.